The Yak-15 is kind of what happens when you take an existing propeller-driven airframe and stick a captured German jet engine onto the front of it. Not really seeing any kind of frontline service, this would primarily be used for parades and for training pilots as they progressed onto more advanced Soviet designs. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me today on the workbench as I take a look at building the PM model Yak-15 in 1/72 scale. As usual, for a more in-depth look at what you get inside the box, particularly the sprues, transfers and instructions, take a look at the dedicated unboxing video I already made on that. In this video though, I'm going to focus on what this kit is like to build and what it looks like at the end. I'll pop a list of products I used during the build on the screen now if you fancy having a go at this one for yourself and need a little bit of inspiration on what to use. But enough of that, let's crack on with the build. So starting off as per usual, I'll use my side cutters to snip away the parts from the plastic sprue. My knife may be required at times to remove the various amounts of flash that this kit features, and any rough plastic and areas that need a little bit more attention will be cleaned up with a sanding stick. I started gluing things together with using some liquid poly from Humbrol. It's not necessarily the best cement in the world, but it does the job. So here you can add the cockpit details into the aircraft. There is a little control column which goes onto the cockpit floor, and then this assembly goes into one side of the fuselage halves. It's a considerably more cockpit detail than the Spitfire we looked at previously. After this, there is a little nozzle part which needs to go into the bottom of the fuselage here, which simulates the exhaust from the jet engine. There is additionally a small intake part which needs to go on the nose here as well, and it glues into the little grooves. Following this, some Humbrol 246, which is a grey-violet paint, was thinned down with some Tamiya X20A thinner. This wasn't done at any particular ratio, potentially sort of about even, so about 3-4 drops of thinner to 4 drops of paint, and then this was applied to all the internal areas just to give them a more uniform look and cover up that grey plastic. Next, Humbrol 62, which is a leather colour, was painted onto the seat for the pilot. This was done straight out of the pot, I didn't bother to thin that one. After this, I could then glue the fuselage halves together, and I took care to make sure that I got it all perfectly aligned. And then when that was done and had dried, I sanded down all the seams with my sanding stick to make it look a little neater. Now I can move on to gluing the wings into place. The wings come as single pieces. It's quite typical to have an upper and a lower part which you then have to join together, but this kit doesn't have this. They come as just one wing, the left wing and the right wing, and they glue into their little slots. Following this, the tail surfaces are glued in a very similar manner. The cannons, which go on the nose of the aircraft, don't really have any mounting points. There is a little bit of a sink mark, which I thought was the right place to put them, but this was a little bit tricky to get in the right place. After this, the tail wheel at the back of the aircraft was glued into its little hole. The cockpit canopy was masked in my normal way, which is to cut little strips of tape and then cover the areas that I needed to. There wasn't very much in the way of detail on this, so I pretty much had to guess where the tape was going from the artwork. Humbrol Clear Fix, which is a clear glue designed for clear parts to prevent them from fogging up, was applied to the canopy very carefully as it is a little bit stringy, and then this was positioned onto the model. The fit is okay, but it is a little bit loose, so I had to take care to get it in the right place. After this generic grey primer was used as a base layer. I didn't wash the plastic to start with, so it may be a little bit greasy, but this primer should stick to the plastic and give a good surface for the subsequent layers of paint, effectively acting as a key to help that paint stick. Now, this Model Air Black from Vallejo was loaded into my airbrush, and I tried very carefully to apply some pre-shading to the panel lines that were kind of visible. There isn't much in the way of detail on this kit, so I tried my best. Whilst this paint was loaded, I also used it on the tyres, which required a coat of this black paint. Up next was Tamiya XF7 Flat Red, which is actually the paint that the instructions ask you to use on this model for this particular paint scheme, but naturally you could use other ones if you wanted to. I used this to fill in the areas where the pre-shading was not applied, and then I would apply very thin coats over the top to try and blend everything in. I haven't done much in the way of pre-shading with an airbrush before, so I think I need a little bit more practice, but eventually I got to a point where I was pretty happy with the results. Like I mentioned, the panel lines don't really exist on this, so this is the only real way I could think of to make them stand out and be a little bit more noticeable. Up next is this gloss varnish, which was loaded into my airbrush and thinned down with some water until it had the consistency of milk. This varnish was airbrushed over the entire model in an attempt to give a smooth, glossy surface in preparation for the transfers, which will come in the next step when this paint has completely cured. I quite like the way this model looks with its glossy finish, so I may try and preserve that when we come to the end of the build. And speaking of the transfers, it's time to get started with these. Included in the kit is a moderately small sheet of transfers which are printed to a reasonable quality. However, I have had trouble with PM model transfers in the past breaking up, so I decided to paint on the top of the transfers I was going to use with some of this micro scale liquid decal film. You don't need too much of this, but it was gently applied to the transfers which were going to be used. You do get 3 transfer schemes in this kit. However, at the end, when you've finished, you've used all of the stars and you actually only have those spare numbers left over. So it's not like you could go and actually make 3 different versions of this kit if you could get your hands on some extra sprues. But nonetheless, I left the micro scale decal film to dry and then I moved on. I'm using Micro Set and Micro Sol as my setting solutions in this build. So first up, Micro Set in the blue bottle. I've already soaked the transfers in warm water off camera, and then I applied some Micro Set onto the area the transfer was going to go and carefully slid them off into place. A little bit of care was needed to get them into the correct position, so a little bit of fiddling and moving around with a cocktail stick was needed. On the whole though, the transfers went onto the model without any real issues. I didn't notice any silvering, and seeing as there's only about 8 to 10 transfers and they are of a moderate size, you can make quick progress. I did notice, however, that these numbers aren't necessarily the most vibrant in colour and are a little washed out when placed on the red background. After this, Micro Sol from the red bottle was brushed onto the top of the transfers after they've had a little bit of time to cure, and all this is going to do is help soften the transfers down into the surface and make them look as though they're painted on. It should help them stick a little bit further and also try to avoid leaving any silvering behind, which is left over from air bubbles. That gloss varnish that we painted on previously will have helped with that as well. I did leave the transfers to dry and then I moved on. I then mixed together this gloss varnish and matte varnish in equal parts in my airbrush with some water just like before. This is going to create a sort of satin varnish. It's not going to be as glossy as it currently is. It's going to dull down that shine, but it's not going to be completely flat. This is because I want this model to be a kind of parade aircraft, as if it's being used on display to show off this kind of technological progress at the time. This was airbrushed over the entire model, and it will also help to seal in those transfers. Now I'm going to focus on the smaller details which are not yet on the model. This gunmetal grey from Vallejo was carefully painted onto the inside of the air intake on the nose of the aircraft, as well as the barrels of the cannons which are on top of the nose. I also paid some attention to the exhaust on the bottom of the aircraft, and I would paint the landing gear legs, which are still on the sprue, with this very same paint. You'll be able to notice the landing gear doors have already been painted in the red previously used. And now I can add these parts to the model. I've already painted the landing gear bays with the grey violet I used on the cockpit interior, and then I glued the landing gear leg into the two holes in this area. The wheels were then added onto their axle mounting point, and I've painted the hubs of the wheels with the gunmetal I previously used on the legs, and then following this, the doors were glued onto the legs, and that is landing gear pretty much complete. Now for a little bit of weathering. This K-Colors XW10 matte acrylic varnish was mixed in equal parts with the Vallejo black I used previously. This was carefully, and I say very carefully, applied to the back area of the model, the underside area where the jet exhaust would be. Because the aircraft has a effectively underslung jet engine, the exhaust would streak down the bottom side of the fuselage, and I tried to replicate this on the model. A number of repeated applications of this, working from the closest point of the jet engine and then streaking it back to create a thinner layer of paint at that location. And eventually, after a while and some very careful application of this paint, I got to a point that I was quite happy with. When that was dry, I flipped the aircraft over and very carefully removed all of the masking tape which was on the cockpit canopy, and it seems to have done a pretty good job of replicating the frame lines. The final step was to glue into place the aerial antenna for the aerial wires, and it's not entirely clear in the instructions where this is supposed to go, so I had to look at some contemporary photos, and it would appear that it went alongside the canopy here, where I've managed to put it. With that, I'm calling my build of the PM model Yak-15 in 1/72 scale complete. So, what do I think of this kit? Well, on the whole, it's fine. It's just fine. It's not a kind of kit that you're gonna go singing the praises of or potentially winning any awards. It's just fine. I don't really know what else to say. It does suffer in quite a few respects with its level of detail, and I'll stand by what I said in my unboxing video, that the details on this, particularly the panel lines, they're effectively non-existent. Yes, I know, we'll address the fact that a lot of people commented on the unboxing video saying that this was based on the Yak-3 and 9, which would have had their panel lines smoothed to make the aircraft much faster in flight. However, the panel lines did still exist, and there were some rivets in a few places on this aircraft which effectively haven't really been reproduced. As you can see in my build, the representation of detail on the aircraft is done through the element of shading to give the impression that there is stuff there. So it is, on the whole, a very simple kit. This is reflected, of course, in the fact that it only has 21 parts and the very low number of transfers required to complete this model. Mold quality on the whole is questionable. There was flash on practically every part that I had to clean away, and also, having built the kit, I've realised now that there are some sink marks which I totally didn't realise. I thought that's where the aerial was going to go, but no, it turns out that's actually a sink mark on the back behind the cockpit. Had I realised that at the time, I would have done something to fill it. And speaking of filling, I didn't use any filler on this aircraft, just to point out to you where it may be required, and you can see around the wing roots and the tailplane that there are some little gaps which are a little bit untidy. It does benefit, of course, from the fact that it does have a small amount of cockpit detail, however, it is very minimal. There is no pilot included, so if you wanted to have this in a flying pose, you may have to source your own one and glue it inside. It doesn't make any reference in the instructions though that you can raise the landing gear and have that option on the aircraft. I think it wouldn't be too hard to glue the landing gear covers into place, however the wheels probably wouldn't fit in the landing gear bays, so you may have to sand them down and cut them to fit if that's an option you wanted to do. The canopy frames, of course, not having much in the way of framing made it a little bit more difficult to get the masking tape on there, but it looks okay in the end. So why might you consider wanting to get this one? Well, it's not a very difficult model to complete, and bearing in mind that you do actually get 3 different paint schemes to choose from, and some of them are relatively simple, it does mean that this would probably be suitable for someone who's just starting out. The instructions are relatively easy to follow, and the transfers are of a moderate quality, although I did use that micro scale film just to ensure they didn't disintegrate. And retailing for £5.50, well, that's what I paid for it at the very least, does mean that it isn't exactly going to break the bank. So this is probably one of the slightly better PM model kits in the sort of pocket money price range that I've looked at recently. And whilst I've mentioned that it could be suitable for a beginner to get some practice in, it may require a little bit of extra work to get it up to a presentable standard, such as filling, sanding, and maybe adding some extra details if that's what you wanted to do. And most of you are probably thinking, yep, there's probably a good reason why this is not the best quality of kit. And whilst this is a 2019 boxing, so fairly recent, the tooling inside the box actually dates from 1988, so it was originally a Pioneer 2 moulding, and as previously mentioned in other videos, this is an old tooling dressed up in a nice new shiny box, and the box is quite attractive and does make you want to buy the model, but sadly it doesn't really reflect the quality of the tooling inside of the box. On the whole though, I had an alright time building this. It wasn't too stressful, and I managed to try out some more pre-shading, and you can realistically get this one finished within a weekend without any real issues. Would I be tempted to get one of these again? Possibly. I mean, you could use this as a fun little mojo build or as something to try out some new skills, but like I've said before, it's not one of those kits that I was super excited about when I'd finished it. After all, it was just fine. And with that, I think it's probably time to wrap this video up here. This is a pocket money kit with a pretty dated tooling, which in the end you can build up into a reasonable representation of the Yak-15, and it does offer you the scope to add lots of extra details and try out some new modelling techniques if you want, but it could provide a few challenges for someone who's just starting out. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of my build and review, and if you agree with my assessment of the model, and what you thought of my finished kit in the end. As always, a quick shout out to my channel members and patrons for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our latest member, which is Diego Frey, who joins us on YouTube. Welcome to the club. Take a look at the links in the description to find out more about how you can get involved and the exclusive perks that being a member or patron will get you. Additionally, there are other one-off ways to help support the channel, which you can find full information down below. The best way to support this channel for free is by subscribing and turning those notifications on so you never miss a modelling upload. The last thing to say though is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.